Tameshia Shelton came from a close-knit Southern family.
Her mother, both of her sisters, her nieces and nephews lived right behind her.
But she was closest to her little sister, Katina.
She kind of felt like she was protecting her.
So she was thrilled when her sister met Danielle.
They was talking about getting married and everything.
He really loved her. This was gonna be the one.
But the wedding wasn't to be.
The call come out over the radio, accidental shooting.
You could hear T in the background screaming. No, what happened? What happened? What happened? No, he's not dead. He's not dead.
Was the shooting simply a tragic accident?
They said he was hunting and the bullet ricocheted and came back and shot him.
Would the evidence suggest another explanation?
Maybe it was a self-inflicted gunshot.
Or did Tameshia and Danielle share a scandalous secret?
He would come in, she would be on a couch in lingerie.
And would it cost Danielle his life?
It was jealousy. It had to be.
West Point, October 16, 2009. It was a typical Friday night in this town of 11,000 in rural northeastern Mississippi.
It's a nice little small, friendly town. Hard-working people. It's a sports town. We love our football teams.
And like every other Friday night in the fall, most of West Point was packed into the stadium at the local high school, cheering on the home team.
This is the South. We do football. That's just sort of where you'll find everyone on a Friday night.
Including the on-duty deputies from the Clay County Sheriff's Office.
A lot of local law enforcement go to the games, provide security, and want to support the team.
But at around 9 o'clock, the deputies rooting for West Point High were suddenly interrupted.
Me and the other investigator, we're at the game. The call come out over the radio, accidental shooting.
The caller was 31-year-old Tameshia Shelton.
There's obvious concern and fear in her voice. She's very, very agitated.
Tameshia told the operator that she'd heard a shot, gone outside to investigate, and found her friend, 21-year-old Danielle Young, lying at the foot of a tree outside her trailer.
She tell 911 that he's making sounds. Look like he's breathing. So the dispatch tell Tameshia not to touch him.
All thoughts of football forgotten, the first responders raced to the scene. But would they get there in time?
Moon Valley is a very rural area of a very rural community. A lot of dirt roads, gravel roads in that vicinity.
You can get out there and feel like you're lost even if you're not.
Tameshia stayed on the line and did what she could to help.
She was trying to describe where the house was and giving the address and explaining where they were located.
And she was still on the line, giving directions to the first responders when Tameshia's little sister Katina arrived at the scene of the shooting.
On the phone with 911, you could hear a car pull up and hear someone get out and start basically screaming, calling out for Danielle. And real hysterical.
But how did Danielle end up outside of Tameshia's trailer? Was it simply a tragic accident? Or would a scandalous secret about Tameshia and her sister's boyfriend reveal that there was more to the shooting than she had let on? Born in 1978, Tameshia Shelton had spent all her life around West Point.
The Sheltons are a large family here in Clay County.
They're a close-knit family, and they're hard-working people.
And Tameshia appeared destined to become another hardworking member of the family. But after graduating high school and getting her associate's degree at the local community college, a sudden illness derailed those plans.
She had a seizure, went into the hospital for a long period of stay.
Tameshia recovered, but the episode had lasting effects.
She was on disability and wasn't working.
But while her disability kept her from working, it did little else to impede her life. And while she never married, she did give birth to a son.
Her baby dad was back and forth with her.
Luckily, Tameshia could count on the support of her close-knit family.
Her mother, both of her sisters, her nieces and nephews lived right behind her, kind of on the same plot of land.
They looked out for Tameshia, and she looked out for them, especially her sister Katina. T, to her family and friends, she was 10 years younger than Tameshia.
Katina was the baby sister, so she kind of felt like she was protecting her.
Although Tameshia couldn't always be there for Katina. After high school, Katina actually left West Point and went all the way to Nashville, Tennessee to pursue a graphic design degree, which is how she met Danielle Young.
Danielle told us he met her at the art college down there.
Born in 1987, Danielle was a Mississippi native from a town 2 hours south of West Point.
We was raised in Forest, Mississippi. It's a small country town, very quiet.
And much like Tameshia and Katina, he'd grown up surrounded by his immediate family, as well as numerous aunts, uncles, and cousins.
It was 13 of us, and my brother David and Edith Faye Young. They have 5 children, and the last 2 was the twin, Dominique and Danielle.
And all of them lived within a mile or so of one another.
It's our family land. We was on a farm. We grew up working hard, learning how to work hard.
We didn't have no silver spoon in our mouth. You know, we basically living off the land. What we ate, we growed it. Our parents grow. When that chicken crow, we're gonna get up. We're gonna be in the garden. We're gonna break that ground.
Growing up, Danielle had 2 passions. One was hunting.
All my brothers, they love to hunt. I used to go with them sometimes, but they like to hunt a lot because my dad, he has all type of rifles.
And when they weren't hunting or working on the farm, Danielle and his brothers would typically be under the hood of a car.
They always love to work on cars. It was, the favorite thing Danielle liked to do is work on cars all the time.
And he planned to turn it into his career.
He would say, when I graduate, I'm gonna be an auto mechanic.
After graduating high school, it appeared that Danielle was destined to realize his dream.
He went straight to Tennessee, to NADC, National Auto Diesel College.
Everybody was proud of it. A young man leaving and fulfilling his goals.
It was while attending school in Nashville that Danielle met Tameshia's little sister, Katina.
We all called her T. They had a relationship. He brought her home. We met her. She was a nice young lady to me.
And she was obviously taken with Danielle.
If you met him, there's just something about him, a charisma about him.
Everybody just loved Danielle because he make you smile. Even on a bad day, he made someone smile. If he see something wrong with someone, he would go to them and ask them, is they okay? He would, joke or make them laugh or something, to make a person feel better.
And once he brought Katina home to meet his family, it was obvious what Danielle saw in her.
She was a nice girl. She was a good person.
She was kind of quiet, but she was sweet.
And it wasn't any mystery why Danielle had brought Katina home to meet the family either.
They was talking about getting married and everything. They was talking about getting them a house together. Whenever he graduated, he was talking about coming home, finding a job so they could get started on what they was trying to do with themselves.
He really loved her. This was going to be the one. That's all he always said, this is going to be the one, Mama.
By 2009, Danielle had finished school.
He come out like second in the class, as far as grades. He pushed himself. He really did.
And while Katina finished up her education in Nashville, Danielle focused on setting himself up in his career.
He had went to Louisiana to live with his brother, and he was working at a shop down there.
But every chance they got, Katina and Danielle would both return to Mississippi to spend time together, mostly at her sister Tameshia's trailer in Moon Valley.
Her parents didn't allow, the man staying in the house with the girlfriend. So that's why Danielle and T stayed at the sister's house.
And since she'd recently given birth to a new baby, a daughter, 31-year-old Tameshia was more than happy to have her sister Katina and her future brother-in-law around to lend a hand.
He's working on a call for Tameshia, so that's just go back to show you the type of guy he was. I'm up here for one thing, but I'll help you out.
Still, while Danielle didn't hesitate to help Tameshia when she needed it, it was her sister Katina he came to see. And on the weekend of October 16th, when Danielle made the long drive to Moon Valley, he was more anxious than ever to see his fiancée.
He actually came up here for her birthday that weekend.
But the celebration would take a tragic turn. Coming up, Tameshia says the shooting was a freak accident.
She said he was shooting a raccoon and the bullet ricocheted.
But something about the scene seems off to the investigators.
If I see a raccoon, a 22 is not my weapon of choice.
At a little after 9 o'clock on October 16, 2009, sheriff's deputies and EMTs raced out to a remote rural home on the outskirts of West Point, Mississippi, responding to a 911 call that had come in moments earlier.
That initial 911 call stated that there had been an accidental shooting out on Moon Valley Road.
According to the caller, 31-year-old Tameshia Shelton, she'd heard a shot, gone outside, and found her sister's boyfriend, 21-year-old Danielle Young, lying at the foot of a tree.
The 911 operator tells Tameshia not to touch the body or to do anything to the body until EMTs arrive. She, at some point, starts talking to someone else who's walked up.
It was Tameshia's sister Katina, also known as T. She'd been dating Danielle since college.
They was talking about getting married as soon as she finished her schooling.
But would their wedding day ever come?
You can hear T holler, she was like, no, what happened, what happened, what happened? No, he's not dead, he's not dead.
When the deputies and EMTs arrived on the scene, they found Danielle exactly as Tameshia had described, lying at the foot of a tree, face down.
They found a handgun that was located where Danielle had been laying face down.
It was a .22 caliber revolver and appeared consistent with the single gunshot wound to Danielle's chest.
It was a small gunshot wound, a little speck.
But it was enough.
The EMT tried to resuscitate him, but all their attempts were futile.
They wasn't getting a pulse from him.
Danielle was dead. And the Clay County Sheriff's Office had a mystery on their hands.
Maybe this was an accident, maybe it was a ricochet, or maybe it was a self-inflicted gunshot.
We didn't know exactly what we were dealing with, and just the fact that somebody has been shot, whether it was self-inflicted or not, is a grave concern for us.
And until sheriff's investigators figured it out, only one thing was certain.
Every case that involves any type of shooting whatsoever, they treat as if it may be a crime.
So mere minutes after the EMTs pronounced Danielle dead, the work of preserving the scene was already underway.
They collected all of the evidence. Danielle's body was preserved by the coroner that had arrived. They bagged his hands up as well so it could be tested for gunshot residue at a later time.
And while they worked, the lead investigator got a brief statement from Tameshia.
The initial statement that she gave to Chief Deputy Williams was that she was laying in bed watching TV. She had her newborn daughter with her in bed.
Tameshia said that Danielle and her sister had gone up the road to her mother's. But then, at a little before 9, there had been a knock on her bedroom window.
She stated that Danielle came to her bedroom window, knocked on the window, and said he seen a raccoon in a tree.
And then, according to Tameshia, Danielle had asked to borrow a gun.
According to Tameshia, she said, well, come around to the door and I'll go get the gun.
She goes and get a .22 pistol, and she tell him when he shoot the raccoon to bring it so she can see it.
Tameshia told the police that Danielle had said sure, taken the pistol, and headed off toward the tree.
She said once she gave the gun to Danielle that she closed the door and stayed inside. She said it may have been 2 or 3 minutes and she heard a gunshot.
Tameshia said she'd looked out the door and called Danielle's name, expecting Danielle to reappear with the dead raccoon. But when he didn't respond, she'd started to worry.
She called Danielle. He never answered. So then Timmy said she went outside, and that's when she seen him, Danielle, laying on the ground, gurgling, making a little noise. So she called 911.
The investigators also spoke to Tameshia's sister, Katina, but she had little to tell them.
Katina was at the home with her mama that night. Apparently, they heard over the police scanner that there had been a shooting out on Moon Valley. So that's how they initially found out that something had happened just right down the road from them.
Katina said that she had rushed down to her sister's trailer while Tameshia was still on the phone with the 911 operator.
You can hear her on the phone, hollering and screaming.
With Danielle's distraught girlfriend unable to add anything, the deputies widened their investigation. But when they canvassed the handful of nearby houses, they found that the neighbors were equally in the dark.
Some of the neighbors told them that they had heard a gunshot, but they really didn't hear anything else.
Which meant that the closest thing the lead investigator had to an eyewitness was Tameshia.
He wanted to take her back to the sheriff's office and do a longer interview at that time, and she said she didn't have any problems doing that.
I told the deputies to take her on to the station. I noticed she had on a house coat. I told her family. I said, Tameshia's gonna need some clothes to put on.
Because the clothes Tameshia was wearing were all taken into evidence so that the investigators could test them for gunshot residue and rule her out as a suspect.
From her statement, she was in the house. She wasn't around the gun when it was fired. She didn't touch him. She said she touched his foot. There shouldn't be any gunshot residue on your hands or on your clothing.
The residue test was a routine matter, as was the record check that the investigators ran on Tameshia.
We didn't find any criminal background on her. I can't recall in the 20 years I've been at this department going out to the shelter's residence for anything.
Her formal interview didn't add anything either.
He asked her to describe what had taken place. Her story was consistent with the 911 tape, as well as the initial statement.
And once again, she explained that she hadn't seen how Danielle had been shot.
One of the things that she was asked about specifically was, were you outside when the gun was fired? And she said, no, I wasn't.
So according to Tameshia, all she could do was speculate about what had happened.
She said it was raining and he had a gun in his hand and he slipped and fell and it went off.
Or maybe he had fired at the raccoon and missed with fatal results.
That he was shooting a raccoon and the bullet ricocheted off the tree and it hit Danielle in his chest and it killed him.
But were those the only possible explanations? In the early hours of the morning, after Tameshia finished her statement and went home, there was something about the incident that definitely bothered the investigators.
Them going out, and shooting a coon in the middle of the night, it just didn't feel right, to us.
And there was one thing in particular that struck the investigators as odd.
When we start sitting down looking at everything, trying to kill a raccoon with a .22 pistol is not a common thing,
My brother's a hunter. He's not finna use a revolver or a pistol to shoot an animal.
Of course, Danielle hadn't really been hunting, just taking a pot shot at an animal that had wandered into the yard with the only weapon available.
She gave the .22 pistol to Danielle because that's the one at the house.
However, even if Danielle had shot at the raccoon with the .22, what were the odds that the bullet would ricochet and hit him square in the chest?
Sometimes a scene will tell you a story, and we just felt that this particular scene we were looking at was not telling us the whole story. Something just wasn't quite adding up.
And according to Danielle's family, a suicide didn't appear too likely either.
He had dreams. He wanted to be a family man. He wanted to start his own business one day. He had worked hard to get to where he was at.
He was making plans. He just wasn't that type of person.
But if it wasn't an accident or a suicide, one possibility remained.
I believe this was a homicide.
Coming up, Danielle's family reveals a possible motive.
It was jealousy. It had to be.
And Tameshia changes her story.
That threw up a flag. Why are you gonna say something like this?
By the morning of October 18th, 2009, it had been barely 24 hours since 21-year-old Danielle Young had been shot dead in West Point, Mississippi, the victim of what police were initially told was an accidental shooting.
They was told that he was trying to shoot a raccoon that was up in a tree, and he shot himself.
At least that's what the woman who lived in the trailer, 31-year-old Tameshia Shelton, had told the investigators.
Danielle Young was dating Tameshia Shelton's sister.
But was Tameshia telling the truth? The investigators had some doubts.
From a person that hunt myself, I'm looking at, if I see a raccoon, a 22 is not my weapon of choice. So that kind of threw up some flags for us.
Their suspicions were reinforced when they talked to Danielle's family.
I said, you don't hunt with a pistol. Danielle know how to hunt. And he was brought up hunting. I said, I don't believe he'll try to kill no coon in no tree with no 22 pistol.
The family also insisted that there was no chance that Danielle had intentionally killed himself, that he and Tameshia's sister Katina had big plans for their future.
They were going to get married. She finished her degree. Then they were going to talk about marriage.
And there was no way that his relationship with her had turned deadly either.
The family said, yeah, they would have arguments occasionally, but they were the typical arguments of kids that were 21 years old.
However, while the family said there was nothing unusual about Danielle and Katina, they did have some concerns about Tameshia.
One of the things that came up was in conversation with Danielle's family. The Young family, multiple people had told us that Danielle had told them in the past that Tameshia had made advances upon him.
I definitely believe that Tameshia had a crush on Danielle.
She was trying to get him to get in the bed with her.
And if what Danielle had told his sister was true, Tameshia hadn't been shy about it either.
She was getting naked and stuff, walking around the house. He'd come in, she would be on the couch in lingerie, She would be exposing herself.
According to the family, Danielle swore that nothing had happened between him and Tameshia.
He said that he never touched her. He wouldn't do that because him and T is getting married.
And now the family wondered, had Danielle's rejection angered Tameshia enough that she'd taken her revenge by murdering him?
It was jealousy. It had to be. He didn't want her.
You could tell that she was obsessed with Danielle. She really was.
Danielle's family was convinced that Tameshia had killed him, but the investigators would require more evidence, especially the results of the gunshot residue tests on Tameshia's hands and clothing.
At that time, all indications were that Tameshia had been inside during the entire shooting.
The gunshot residue tests could reveal whether or not Tameshia was telling the truth, but getting the results from the crime lab would take time.
We have one crime lab that serves all 82 counties, and we frequently have to get in line and just wait our turn for our evidence to be processed.
So while the investigators waited for the results of the residue tests, they asked Tameshia to come in and take a polygraph. And while she agreed, when she came in to take the test, it appeared that Tameshia was having second thoughts before she was even hooked up to the machine.
The polygraph examiner, when he spoke with Tameshia, for the first time we hear her mention that she had in fact fired a gun.
According to Tameshia, she had shot the gun on Wednesday, 2 days before Danielle was killed.
She said that there had been a dog in the area chasing her son or her nephew or somebody there in the area. She said that she fired the gun trying to scare the dog off.
Tameshia said the fact that she had fired a gun had previously slipped her mind during the turmoil that followed Danielle's death.
She started telling the story again of exactly as it matched up with the 911 tape, that she heard the gunshot and that she ran outside to check on Danielle and that he was groaning.
However, as Tameshia wrapped up her preliminary interview with the polygraph technician, her story changed again.
She tells him that she had in fact handled the gun and shot that gun on Friday.
And according to Tameshia's new story, she'd fired it just a few hours before Danielle died.
That threw up a flag. Why are you going to say something like this,
Was it because she was worried about what the gunshot residue test might reveal?
It was our interpretation at that time that the timing of those changes in her story were extremely relevant.
The investigators hoped that the polygraph would reveal the truth. But would the stress be too much for Tameshia to take?
We set up for the polygraph, and right before the polygraph, she had a seizure.
She had some health issues. She had seizures and various things.
The investigators called an ambulance.
She was taken to the emergency room.
And when she was evaluated and released within an hour, the investigators were left wondering, had Tameshia really been overcome by stress? Or was the timing of her seizure just a little too convenient?
I'm not a doctor, so I can't tell you what brings them on and what not. But this particular day, when you're going to take a polygraph that going to ask you questions where you did this murder or not, you have a seizure. Who's to say?
However, by then, the investigators did know one thing for certain. The medical examiner had ruled out any possibility that Danielle's death might be a suicide. The autopsy confirmed that Danielle had died from a single gunshot, but that wasn't all it revealed.
The autopsy gave us the trajectory on the bullet that entered the body.
And according to the medical examiner, the bullet had entered Danielle's body from dead ahead, almost a perfect 90-degree angle.
She's seen hundreds of suicides, and her explanation was, in every suicide that she's ever seen by gunshot, there's always some deviation. She's never seen one in a suicide go straight through the body at a 90-degree angle.
How you go try to turn your wrist to shoot yourself, right here, and that's an awkward position.
But if Danielle hadn't fired the fatal shot, did that mean Tameshia was the killer? For the authorities, it was still too soon to say.
It took a while until we had sufficient evidence, which meant getting everything back that we had from the crime lab.
It was a frustrating time for Danielle's family.
Many times I did call there to the sheriff department and speak with Mr. William. He himself, and he would constantly tell me that they were still working on the case.
And when, after months of waiting, the test results finally came back from the crime lab, one thing immediately stood out to the investigators. In addition to testing the sample swab from Danielle and Tameshia's hands, the crime lab also tested their clothes, Tameshia's for gunshot residue, and Danielle's to determine where the gun was fired in relation to his body.
You can request that they make a determination based on the stippling on the clothing, whether or not there are burn marks from the flash of the muzzle.
And according to the crime lab, the scorch marks on Danielle's clothes were revealing.
He was shot with the gun pressed into his chest, into his clothing.
And tests of the clothing Tameshia had been wearing the night of the shooting were just as telling.
She had gunshot residue on her pajamas.
Which meant she couldn't have been in the trailer when the shot was fired.
You have to be in the area when that gun is fired to get this much residue on you.
And that wasn't the only place Tameshia had gunshot residue either.
It was on the palm of her hands, on the back of her hand.
All the evidence pointed to Tameshia as Danielle's killer.
Chief Deputy Williams at that time thought he had enough to go to the grand jury.
But an actual arrest would take time.
Our grand jury only meet twice a year.
And with the next meeting still months away, their prime suspect would remain free.
Tameshia just went on living her life. She stayed in the same house, lived there close to her family.
Meanwhile, Danielle's family's frustration grew.
There was times I felt like his case was going to go unsolved.
What I was feeling was concern for my auntie. The look that she toted, that she bared upon herself, it wasn't something that you would wish upon anybody.
It wasn't until April of 2011, a year and a half after Danielle's murder, that the moment the family and the authorities had been waiting for finally arrived.
The grand jury returned a true bill, which basically meant that there was more than probable cause that she committed the crime.
Once she had been indicted, a warrant is issued at that time. From my understanding, she was told that it was there and came and turned herself in to the sheriff's office.
Tameshia was finally in custody, but could the prosecutors make the charges stick? Coming up, will Tameshia's case ever go to trial?
I thought they would probably let her go.
Or will the investigators uncover shocking new evidence?
We actually did a DNA test on her young baby.
2015, Tameshia Shelton finally went on trial for murder at the Clay County Courthouse in West Point, Mississippi. The 37-year-old was charged with killing her sister's boyfriend, Danielle Young, who'd been shot dead almost 6 years earlier in October of 2009.
You watch TV shows, and it's like the crime happened, and next thing you know, they're in court, and the person is convicted. When it comes to life, it don't work that way.
Which wasn't much consolation for Danielle's family.
I know they were frustrated, and we had a lot of conversations with them that were not pleasant to have, that were difficult to have, but we wanted to make sure that we were confident in what we were putting in front of the jury and that we could strengthen our case in any way possible.
We was told that if they went ahead and she was not found guilty, we could never have another trial. And that's why it took them so long.
Just as frustrating for the family, Tameshia had spent almost the entire 4 years since her arrest out on bail.
The bond was set at $75,000, I believe, and shortly thereafter, she and her family were able to make bond, and she was able to stay at home awaiting trial.
Not only was she in her own home, the mother of two went on with her life as if she'd never been charged with murder.
She was dating somebody, and after this happened, she had 2 more children.
Which only added to the delays in bringing the case to trial.
Every time it was time for us to go to court for it, they would change it. Either she was having a baby or something else was going on.
Danielle's family had almost lost all hope.
I thought they would probably let her go.
But finally, after years of waiting, it was time to find out. Did the prosecutors have enough evidence to send the mother of 4 to prison for murder?
On the morning of trial, the last thing that Danielle's mother said was, "Do the best you can."
In his opening statement, the prosecutor told the jury that the evidence proved Tameshia had pulled the trigger.
She had these particles on the palms of her hands, on the back of one hand, and on both her pajama shirt and pants. She had to be in the area of a discharged weapon.
And yet, as the prosecutors pointed out to the jury, Tameshia had always claimed that she had been inside the trailer when the fatal shot was fired.
At no point did she admit that she was anywhere in the vicinity of that gun being fired.
Although once she realized that the investigators were testing her for gunshot residue, she had started coming up with explanations for why they might find some.
We had been told that she had, in fact, shot the gun on Wednesday, and then that she had handled the gun on Friday but not shot it. Finally, she had, in fact, shot the gun earlier that same day.
The story basically changed every time they talked to her.
And according to the prosecution, even if she was telling the truth, if she had fired a gun several hours prior to the shooting, it was unlikely that it would have skewed the test results.
During the course of those interviews, she also explained that she had cooked dinner for her family. She had taken care of her baby, a newborn, grabbing diapers, using wipes, things like that.
Could she really have done all that without washing her hands at least once?
There's no way she had gunshot residue on her from hours before.
But would the forensic evidence alone be enough to secure a conviction?
We don't have to prove motive, but we also know it's human nature to expect that there's going to be some bow that we can tie this up with at the end and say, this is what happened, in order to satisfy the jury.
But why would Tameshia kill Danielle? After all, he was her sister's boyfriend, not hers, which was precisely the problem, according to Danielle's family. They believed Tameshia acted out of jealousy.
Danielle told us that she was coming at him. She was trying to get with Danielle and things, and he was like, he wasn't going to do that.
And the family was convinced that by remaining faithful to Tameshia's sister Katina, or T as everyone knew her, that Danielle further enraged Tameshia.
I feel like she was jealous of my brother and T relationship because he was a good guy. And he was talking about marrying T. She didn't have a man like that.
They felt like she was, I guess, a spurned lover or somebody that got her feelings hurt in this, and maybe that was the motive.
Or was it possible he hadn't been faithful?
She did have 2 children at home with her. One of those was a relative newborn. One of the things that came up, whether or not that child may have been Danielle's child.
Was it possible that Danielle had hooked up with Tameshia, only to turn his back on her? It would have made a compelling motive for murder if it were true.
We actually did a DNA test on her young baby, but it came back that he was not the father.
The paternity test may have exonerated Danielle, but it left the prosecutors in a bind as far as the rumors that Tameshia had become infatuated with her sister's boyfriend.
We didn't have anything that was substantive that could prove that. Any statements that the family had were hearsay from Danielle. We didn't have anything that led us to believe there'd been any relationship other than those statements.
And since it was hearsay, the jury would never hear it.
If we had followed that line and introduced that as a motive, the concern is we lose credibility with the jury. If we don't have something to back up what we present before them, the case will be over before we even get to closing arguments, and we didn't want to risk that.
However, that presented the defense with an opportunity, one they took full advantage of when presenting their case.
The defense's position was, why would Tameshia Shelton have killed Danielle Young? There appeared to be no ill will between the two.
After all, she'd let her sister and Danielle stay at her trailer, and he'd been helping Tameshia out, tinkering with a couple broken down cars she had parked in the yard.
He was trying to get those up and running.
And the lack of a motive wasn't the only thing the defense had to raise reasonable doubt. They also did their best to undermine the forensic evidence that provided the foundation of the prosecution's case.
Their argument was that it was self-inflicted, that he killed himself.
And they had a powerful witness to back up those claims, Tameshia's sister, Katina.
During her testimony, she tried to say that Danielle had tried to take his life when they lived in Nashville, that he had taken pills at some point.
Katina's testimony took the prosecution by surprise.
That flew in the face of everything that we had learned from Danielle's family.
But if it wasn't true, why would Katina lie for her fiancé's accused killer?
Obviously, she's torn in two different directions. She very much cared for Danielle Young. I believe that. However, she also had a sister that she had known her entire life. Katina was probably doing whatever she could to protect and cover for her sister.
On cross, the prosecution did its best to contain the damage, pointing out that the bullet had entered Danielle's body at a 90-degree angle.
We argued to the jury that seemed far more consistent with someone placing the gun and pointing it straight ahead rather than the person shooting actually turning the gun on themselves and firing the gun into their chest.
And while Danielle did have gunshot residue on his hands, the residue on Tameshia was far more damning.
The gunshot residue on Tameshia was on the palms of her hands. It's common to see gunshot residue on the palms of the person who actually fires the weapon.
Danielle had gunshot residue on the back of his hand.
Did Danielle get gunshot residue on the backs of his hands because he'd been trying to ward off Tameshia when she pulled the trigger?
If there wasn't any on the palms of the hands, it probably meant you weren't the person holding the gun.
That's what the prosecution claimed. But Tameshia didn't appear to be too worried.
Just sit there like, just calm or nothing.
She wanted to take the stand to speak on her behalf.
Which meant that when the jury retired to reach a verdict, their decision would depend entirely on how they interpreted the forensic evidence.
For both sides, it was, this is what couldn't have happened, and this is what probably happened. Nobody could say, this is what happened.
Coming up, tempers flare as the jury struggles to reach a decision.
We could hear raised voices.
But what will it mean for Tameshia?
She was finna get off on this murder charge.
Almost 6 years after Danielle Young had died mysteriously outside a trailer, a Mississippi jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the murder trial of 37-year-old Tameshia Shelton.
It came down to one of two people pulled the trigger on that gun, and it was either Tameshia Shelton or it was Danielle Young.
It had taken the jury 2 hours to reach a decision.
It got heated at times. We could hear raised voices. You can't tell what they're saying, but there is always heightened anxiety once that jury goes out. You don't know what they're going to do.
But for all the prosecutor's anxiety, Tameshia appeared confident.
She sat there just smiling, like she didn't have a care in the world. I feel like Tameshia felt like she was finna get off on this murder charge.
But was her confidence misplaced?
The jury returned with a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder.
The courtroom erupted at the news.
They read the verdict in court. Her sister started hollering, "She has kids. She has kids."
Although Tameshia took her conviction surprisingly well.
We didn't see tears. We didn't see any cries out or anything like that from the defendant.
Danielle's family was an entirely different story, however.
There were a lot of hugs and tears in that room after the verdict was read.
It was just, it's over with. He's free.
Although after waiting so long to see Tameshia convicted, the family's relief was tinged with more than a little bitterness.
No one should have to wait and suffer the length that our family have had to wait before justice was served.
The only question remaining was how long Tameshia would pay for her crime. And on July 20th, she was back in court to find out. She received a life sentence with the eventual possibility of parole.
The way she was sentenced, she'll have to serve until she's 65 years of age.
Although even then, there's no guarantee she'll get out.
If my family has any say-so, she won't get it because you took a life. And I feel like she should sit in jail for it, She should never be able to get out.
However, despite all the pain Danielle's death caused the family, his mother has tried to forgive Tameshia.
My children, they had a lot of hatred. I told them I didn't hate the girl. I couldn't feel no hate.
But even forgiveness won't change what happened.
It shouldn't have to come to all this. All she had to do was tell the truth. Just say you did it. We knew you did it.
Who could have wanted my mother dead?
Is it either going to result in a confession?
On a Sunday in June 1964, 3 young men left Meridian, Mississippi, expecting to return before the day was over. Their names were James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. They were not criminals, fugitives, or men looking for trouble. They were civil rights workers, involved in a campaign that sought to help Black Americans exercise rights that, on paper, were supposed to belong to every citizen. Their destination was Neshoba County, where a Black church had recently been burned. They intended to investigate what had happened and to meet with people in the local community. It was a journey connected to the work they had already been doing. It was also the last journey they would ever make. By the time the country learned what had happened to them, the 3 men had become more than missing persons. Their names had become symbols of a violent period in American history, a period in which the simple act of helping Black citizens register to vote could place civil rights workers in danger. On June 21, 1964, James Chaney was 21 years old. He was Black, born in Mississippi, and familiar with the environment in which he was working. He was associated with the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE, and had taken part in efforts to help Black residents register to vote. He was also involved in the broader Freedom Summer campaign of 1964. Unlike the 2 men who accompanied him on that final journey, Chaney was a local. He knew Mississippi in a way that outsiders could not. He understood the social environment, the hostility towards civil rights workers, and the dangers that could accompany their work. Michael Schwerner was 24. He was white and came from New York. He was also a CORE activist, and he had moved to Mississippi with his wife, Rita Schwerner, to work with Black communities. His activities focused on civil rights and voting rights, and his work had attracted hostility from people who opposed the movement. Andrew Goodman was 20 years old, a white student from New York who had come to Mississippi during Freedom Summer. He had not been in the state for long. His decision to participate in the campaign brought him into the same dangerous environment in which Chaney and Schwerner had already been working. On June 21st, these 3 very different young men were together. Chaney was a local Black activist who understood the landscape around him. Schwerner was an experienced civil rights worker from New York who had committed himself to organizing in Mississippi. Goodman was a young student who had arrived to contribute to the Freedom Summer Campaign. What brought them together was the same cause: the struggle to expand civil rights and voting rights for Black Americans. To understand why their disappearance became such a defining case, it is necessary to understand Mississippi in 1964. The American South was still deeply marked by racial segregation and discrimination. Black Americans faced serious barriers when attempting to register to vote. They also encountered discrimination in education, employment, and access to public services. Civil rights workers who challenged this system could face threats, beatings, arrests, destruction of property, and the burning of churches. In some cases, the violence went further. The Freedom Summer Campaign of 1964 brought hundreds of volunteers and activists into Mississippi. Its goals included helping Black citizens register to vote, creating community schools, and encouraging greater participation in political life. For those who supported the movement, it was a campaign for basic civil rights. For extremist opponents of the movement, it represented a threat to the existing racial order. The atmosphere was therefore tense before Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner ever entered the car on that June morning. 6 days earlier, on June 16th, Mount Zion Methodist Church in Neshoba County had been burned. The church was a Black church, and Schwerner and Cheney had already been involved with the local community and were concerned about the possibility of using the church as a place for civil rights activities. After the fire, the two men decided that they needed to return to Neshoba County to investigate what had happened. Andrew Goodman went with them. Their journey was not presented as a search for confrontation. They were going to examine the church fire and meet people in the local community. They were then expected to return to Meridian. Instead, the journey would become the center of one of the most notorious cases of the civil rights era. That morning, June 21st, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner left Meridian in a Ford station wagon belonging to Corps. They drove toward Neshoba County. Somewhere ahead of them was the burned Mount Zion Methodist Church, a community that had already experienced intimidation and violence, and a local environment in which civil rights work had become increasingly dangerous. Behind them was Meridian. The three men had no way of knowing that they would never make the return journey. They reached Neshoba County and carried out the purpose of their visit. But when they began traveling back toward Meridian, their journey changed. They were stopped in Philadelphia, Mississippi by Cecil Ray Price, a deputy sheriff of Neshoba County. The identity of the person who stopped them would later become one of the most important elements in the investigation. Price was not simply a stranger on the road. He was a local law enforcement officer. The three civil rights workers were arrested on an allegation involving a traffic violation and taken to the Neshoba County Jail. Their Corps vehicle was held while the three men remained in custody. Then, at approximately 10 o'clock that night, they were released. On the surface, that might have appeared to be the end of the matter. Three men had been stopped, arrested, held for several hours, and then released. They should have been able to continue their journey home. But according to the investigation that followed, Price knew where they were going and communicated with other people. After leaving Philadelphia, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner started back toward Meridian. They were traveling in the same vehicle, apparently expecting to complete the journey they had begun that morning. They did not know that they were being followed. Somewhere beyond Philadelphia, the road ahead of them was no longer simply the road home. A group connected to the Ku Klux Klan and other accomplices had been mobilized. Among the people later identified as connected to the events were Cecil Price, Wayne Roberts, James Jordan, Alton Wayne Roberts, Edgar Ray Killen, and other Klan members. Samuel Holloway Bowers, a Klan leader in Mississippi, was also an important figure in the broader circumstances surrounding the case, although he was not identified as the person who directly carried out the killings. The three young men continued driving through the Mississippi night. They had left Meridian that morning to investigate a burned church. They had traveled to Neshoba County, met with the local community, and then begun their return. They They had been arrested and released. Now they were on the road again. What they could not know was that their movements were being watched. Their Ford station wagon would not reach Meridian. The three men would not return to their families, their colleagues, or their work. Their disappearance would soon trigger one of the largest searches of the era, draw the attention of the federal government, and become known by a name that would enter American history, Mississippi Burning. But on that night, before the search began and before the truth was uncovered, there was only a road through Mississippi, three young men traveling home, and the growing certainty among those pursuing them that the journey would end somewhere far from the public eye. 44 days later, investigators would uncover what had happened beneath a dirt dam near Philadelphia. But at that moment, the three men were still simply missing. Their families did not yet know that they had been murdered. The country did not yet know their fate. And the road between Neshoba County and Meridian had become the beginning of a case that would expose not only the violence inflicted upon three civil rights workers, but also the profound struggle over race, voting rights, law enforcement, and justice that defined Mississippi in the summer of 1964. To understand what happened to James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, it is not enough to begin with the night they disappeared. The final hours of their lives were shaped by events that had been unfolding long before June 21st, 1964. They were three individuals with different backgrounds, different experiences, and different reasons for being in Mississippi. Yet their paths converged around one cause: the struggle to expand civil rights and voting rights for Black Americans. Their story, therefore, begins not with the road outside Philadelphia, but with the people themselves and the society into which they had entered. James Earl Chaney was 21 years old. He was Black and came from Meridian, Mississippi. That distinction mattered. Chaney was not a visitor passing through an unfamiliar part of the South. Mississippi was his home. He knew the environment in which civil rights workers were operating, and he understood the dangers that could accompany their efforts. He worked with the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and participated in efforts to help Black residents register to vote. He was also involved in the Freedom Summer Campaign of 1964. His work placed him directly within one of the most important civil rights efforts of the period. For Chaney, the struggle was not something happening somewhere far away. It was happening in the communities where he lived and worked. The effort to register Black voters challenged a system in which Black Americans faced serious barriers to participating fully in political life. Voting was one of the central questions of the movement because political participation represented more than the ability to cast a ballot. It meant having a voice in the society in which people lived. Yet in Mississippi, Black citizens faced major obstacles when attempting to register. Civil rights workers attempted to confront those obstacles, and people who opposed the movement responded with hostility. Chaney worked within that difficult environment. He knew that civil rights activism could bring threats, violence, arrests, and other forms of intimidation. He also knew the local communities and the realities of Mississippi better than the two young men, who would eventually accompany him on his final journey. Michael Henry Schwerner was 24 years old and white. He came from New York, far from the Mississippi communities in which he would later work. He became a CORE activist and, together with his wife, Rita Schwerner, moved to Mississippi to participate in civil rights work. His focus was on working with Black communities and supporting efforts connected to voting rights. Schwerner was not simply passing through the state as an observer. He had committed himself to working there. That commitment brought him into direct contact with people who opposed the civil rights movement. His work attracted hostility precisely because he was actively helping organize communities and supporting efforts to expand voting rights. His presence in Mississippi, therefore, carried a particular meaning. He was a white man from the North who had entered a deeply segregated Southern society and was working with Black residents to challenge racial barriers. Andrew Goodman was 20 years old. He was also white and came from New York. He was a student who traveled to Mississippi during the Freedom Summer Campaign. Unlike Chaney and Schwerner, Goodman had only recently arrived in the state. His involvement placed him in an environment that was already dangerous for civil rights activists. He came to participate in a campaign whose goals included helping Black Americans register to vote, creating community schools, and encouraging greater participation in political life. Goodman would spend only a short time in Mississippi, but his name would eventually become permanently connected to the history of the movement. The three men therefore represented different parts of the same struggle. Cheney was a young Black Mississippian who knew the community and had personal experience with the society they were trying to change. Schwerner was an older civil rights worker from New York who had moved south with his wife and committed himself to organizing. Goodman was a young student who had come to Mississippi during Freedom Summer to contribute to the campaign. Their backgrounds were different, but their work brought them together. To understand the danger they faced, however, we have to understand the broader environment of Mississippi in 1964. The state was part of a region where racial segregation and discrimination remained deeply established. Black Americans faced obstacles not only in voting, but also in education, employment, and access to public services. Civil rights workers who challenged these conditions could face threats, beatings, arrests, property destruction, and the burning of churches. The violence was not merely a disagreement over political ideas. It could become physical and deadly. Freedom Summer brought hundreds of volunteers and activists into Mississippi in 1964. The campaign sought to confront the barriers preventing Black citizens from registering to vote and participating fully in political life. It also included community schools and other efforts designed to strengthen Black communities. To those participating in the movement, these were basic civil rights. But to extremist opponents of the movement, the campaign represented a threat to the racial order they wanted to preserve. This conflict formed the background to everything that happened to Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. 6 days before the three men disappeared, the conflict became visible in a particularly destructive way. On June 16, 1964, Mount Zion Methodist Church in Neshoba County was burned. The church served a Black community, and it had become connected to the civil rights activity taking place in the area. Schwerner and Cheney had already worked with people in the local community and were concerned about the possibility of using the church as a location for civil rights activities. After the church was burned, they decided to return to Neshoba County to investigate what had happened. Their decision was not isolated from their previous work. It followed naturally from the responsibilities they had taken on as civil rights workers. They were going back to a community they already knew and to a situation that required attention. Andrew Goodman went with them. That decision connected the three men on the journey that would become the final day of their lives. The importance of the Mount Zion Church cannot be separated from the broader environment in which the three were operating. A burned church was not simply damaged property. In the context of the civil rights movement, the destruction of a Black church could represent an attack on a community and on the activities taking place there. The church was part of the local community, and Schwerner and Cheney believed the situation needed to be investigated. Goodman joined them, and on the morning of June 21st, the three left Meridian in a core Ford station wagon. Their purpose was straightforward: travel to Neshoba County, investigate the church fire, and meet with people in the local community. Once their work was finished, they intended to return to Meridian. Nothing about that plan suggested that the journey would become a defining event in American history. But the danger surrounding them was real. The men were working in a place where civil rights activists had already faced threats and violence. They were challenging a system that had resisted political equality for Black Americans for generations, and their work had brought them into direct conflict with people who viewed the civil rights movement as an unacceptable threat. Cheney understood that environment personally. Schwerner had already experienced hostility because of his organizing work. Goodman, although new to Mississippi, had entered the same dangerous field of activity. On June 21st, their three lives became inseparable. They traveled together toward Neshoba County, connected by a mission that was part of a much larger movement. They did not know that the burned church they were going to investigate would be the last major destination they would reach. They did not know that their return journey would be interrupted. They did not know that their disappearance would eventually trigger a massive search and attract the attention of the federal government. And they certainly could not know that decades later, their names would still be associated with one of the most notorious cases of the American civil rights era. At this point in the story, however, there were still 3 young men doing work they believed was necessary. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner had entered the Mississippi summer with the intention of helping change a society that denied basic rights to millions of people. Their destination was a burned church. Their immediate task was to understand what had happened there. Their ultimate goal was larger: to help create a society in which black citizens could exercise rights that should never have been denied to them. The significance of their story lies partly in that contrast. They were engaged in a campaign centered on voting, education, community organization, and civil rights. Yet the forces opposing that campaign were willing to answer those efforts with intimidation and violence. By June 21st, the 3 men had become part of that confrontation. They left Meridian together. They traveled to Neshoba County together. And before the day was over, the peaceful purpose of their journey would be overtaken by a chain of events that would end their lives and transform their names into symbols of the struggle they had entered. The story of Mississippi burning was about to move from the world of civil rights organizing into the world of arrest, pursuit, disappearance, and murder. But before that happened, there were 3 people at the center of it all. A 21-year-old local activist named James Chaney, a 24-year-old organizer named Michael Schwerner, and a 20-year-old student named Andrew Goodman. They were not symbols yet. They were simply human beings who had chosen to act. On June 16, 1964, 5 days before James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner disappeared, Mount Zion Methodist Church in Neshoba County, Mississippi, was burned. The church belonged to a black community, and its destruction took place against the wider background of racial tension and resistance to the civil rights movement that had already made Mississippi a dangerous place for activists. For Chaney and Schwerner, the fire was not an isolated incident that could simply be ignored. They had been working with people in the local community, and they were concerned about the possibility of using the church as a location for civil rights activities. The burning of the church, therefore, became something they needed to investigate. It was a reason to return to Neshoba County. It was also the immediate circumstance that brought the 3 men together on the journey that would become their last. By the summer of 1964, civil rights workers in Mississippi understood that their work could provoke hostility. The campaign was built around activities that, in another setting, might have appeared ordinary: helping people register to vote, meeting with members of local communities, organizing educational efforts, and encouraging greater participation in political life. But in Mississippi, these activities challenged a deeply established system of racial discrimination. Black citizens faced serious barriers to registering to vote, as well as discrimination in education, employment, and access to public services. The Freedom Summer Campaign was designed to confront those barriers. Hundreds of volunteers and activists came to Mississippi to participate. James Chaney was already part of this work. As a young black man from Meridian, he knew the local environment in a way that Andrew Goodman, a young student from New York, could not. Michael Schwerner, also from New York, had moved to Mississippi with his wife, Rita, and was working as a core activist. Schwerner and Chaney had already been involved with the local community around Neshoba County. The burning of Mount Zion Methodist Church, therefore, required their attention. They decided to return to the area. Andrew Goodman went with them. On the morning of June 21, 1964, the 3 men left Meridian in a Ford station wagon belonging to CORE. Their purpose was specific. They were traveling to Neshoba County to investigate the church fire and meet with people in the local community. They were not traveling there to provoke a confrontation. Their work was part of the same civil rights campaign that had brought them to Mississippi in the first place. Once the work was completed, they intended to return to Meridian. That simple plan would never be completed. The journey from Meridian to Neshoba County was a movement from one part of their ordinary civil rights work into the center of the events that would ultimately destroy their lives. The men reached Neshoba County and carried out the purpose of their visit. They investigated the circumstances surrounding Mount Zion Methodist Church and met with people in the community. At some point, their work was finished, and they began the return journey toward Meridian. Nothing about their destination had changed. Meridian was where they expected to end the day. Their Ford station wagon was the vehicle that connected the beginning and intended end of the journey. But the return trip would not be completed. Somewhere between their work in Neshoba County and their destination in Meridian, they were stopped in Philadelphia, Mississippi. The man who stopped them was Cecil Ray Price, a deputy sheriff of Neshoba County. Price's role would later become one of the central elements of the investigation. The three men were not simply stopped by an unknown motorist. The person who intervened was a local law enforcement officer. Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were arrested on an allegation involving a traffic violation. They were taken to the Neshoba County Jail. Their core vehicle was held while they remained in custody. At this point, the journey had already changed dramatically. What had begun as a trip to investigate a burned church had become a police arrest. Yet there was still reason, at least on the surface, to believe that the matter would end with their release. They had been detained. Their vehicle had been held. But eventually, they would leave the jail and continue home. That is what happened next, but the events surrounding their release would later become critical. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, the three men were released. Their vehicle was no longer simply part of a routine journey. The men were now leaving Philadelphia after spending hours in custody. According to the investigation that followed, Price knew where they were going and communicated with other people. That detail would become important because it connected the official arrest to the events that followed. The men themselves did not know what was waiting for them after their release. Once they left Philadelphia, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner began traveling toward Meridian. It was the same basic objective they had possessed when they left that morning, to return home after completing their work. But the circumstances were no longer the same. Their movements were being watched. A group connected to the Ku Klux Klan and other accomplices had been mobilized. Among the people later identified as connected to the events were Cecil Price, Wayne Roberts, James Jordan, Alton Wayne Roberts, Edgar Ray Killen, and other Klan members. Samuel Holloway Bowers, a Klan leader in Mississippi, was also an important figure in the broader circumstances surrounding the case, although he was not identified as the person who directly carried out the killings. The existence of this group changed the meaning of the road ahead. For Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the journey was a return trip. For those pursuing them, it was something else. The three men did not know they were being followed. Their Ford station wagon moved through the Mississippi night, carrying three young people who believed they were simply making their way back to Meridian. Behind them, however, the events that had begun with the church fire were moving toward their most violent conclusion. The earlier arrest now took on a different significance. The presence of a local law enforcement officer in the sequence of events would later become an important part of the case. The release at approximately 10 o'clock was no longer simply the final moment of a traffic-related detention. It was the point after which the three men left the protection, however limited, of the jail and continued onto the road. The exact destination was still Meridian, but the men would never reach it. There is a particular weight to the fact that their journey began with a burned church. The church represented the community they were trying to assist. Cheney and Schwerner had already established connections there, and they believed the destruction required investigation. Goodman accompanied them because he was participating in Freedom Summer. Their objective was tied to the larger struggle for civil rights, to work with local people, to understand what had happened, and to continue organizing in a state where such efforts were met with hostility. Nothing about their mission required violence. Yet their work placed them directly in the path of people who opposed the movement. By the time they left Philadelphia, the situation had moved beyond political disagreement. They were being pursued. As the three men continued toward Meridian, the distance between them and their intended destination meant little. They were still unaware of the danger surrounding them. The night ahead would become the decisive chapter of their lives. Their final hours would not be spent in the company of friends or colleagues, but in the custody of men who had organized to intercept them. The Ford station wagon would not arrive in Meridian. Instead, it would eventually be abandoned and burned. The three men would be forced from their vehicle and taken somewhere away from the main road. But at this stage, none of that was visible to them. Their journey still looked like a return home. The significance of June 21st would only become clear later, after the three disappeared and the country began searching for them. For their families and colleagues, the immediate question would be simple and devastating. Where were James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner? The answer would not come quickly. It would take 44 days before investigators found their bodies. And before that discovery, the nation would enter a period of uncertainty, suspicion, and an enormous search that would bring the federal government directly into the case. But first, the road out of Philadelphia had to reach its final point. The three men continued toward Meridian, unaware that they were being followed by a group of men connected to the Ku Klux Klan. Behind them was the town where they had been arrested and released. Behind that was Neshoba County and the burned Mount Zion Methodist Church. Ahead was the road home. They never made it. The journey that had begun as an investigation into the destruction of a black church was about to become a murder case that would expose the violence surrounding the civil rights struggle in Mississippi and remain in the national memory for decades. The return journey to Meridian should have been the ordinary final stage of a difficult day. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner had traveled to Neshoba County to investigate the burning of Mount Zion Methodist Church and to meet with people in the local community. Their work was connected to the larger Freedom Summer Campaign, a campaign that sought to help Black Americans register to vote, establish community schools, and participate more fully in political life. By the time they began their journey back, the immediate purpose of their trip had been completed. But somewhere along the road, the three men encountered Cecil Ray Price, a deputy sheriff of Neshoba County. That encounter would become one of the most consequential moments in the entire case. Price was not an anonymous figure standing beside a rural road. He was a local law enforcement officer. His authority came from the very system that was supposed to enforce the law. When he stopped the three civil rights workers, the situation changed immediately. The Ford station wagon they were traveling in belonged to CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the three men were working as civil rights activists. They had already entered an environment where their activities were met with hostility, and now they were being stopped by a deputy sheriff. According to the information available in the case, the three were arrested on an allegation involving a traffic violation. The reason given for the arrest, therefore, appeared to concern an ordinary matter of law enforcement. But what followed would make that arrest far more significant than it initially appeared. Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner were taken to the Neshoba County Jail. Their vehicle was held, separating the three men from the means by which they had intended to return to Meridian. For the moment, their movements were controlled by the local authorities. They were no longer simply civil rights workers traveling through the county. They were prisoners inside a local jail. The situation might have ended there. A traffic-related arrest could have been processed, the men released, and the incident forgotten. But the sequence of events did not follow that ordinary path. Instead, the hours they spent in custody became part of a chain that eventually led to their deaths. The significance of the arrest would become clearer only after the three men disappeared. At the time, however, there was no way for the public to know what was happening inside the jail or what connections existed beyond it. What is known from the later investigation is that Cecil Price knew where the three men were going after their release and communicated with other people. That detail would become crucial because it connected the deputy sheriff's actions to what happened. After the three men left Philadelphia, The arrest, therefore, occupies an unusual position in the story. It was an official act carried out by a law enforcement officer, but it was followed by a sequence of events involving members of the Ku Klux Klan and other accomplices. The line between the arrest and the violence that followed would become one of the central issues in understanding the case. For Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the hours in jail must have represented an interruption in their journey. Their destination remained Meridian. Their work in Neshoba County was over, and they had every reason to expect that they would eventually continue home. The three men had already spent the day dealing with a serious situation. A black church had been burned, and they had gone to investigate. They had not traveled to Neshoba County intending to become involved in a confrontation with law enforcement. Yet now they were being held. Their vehicle was being kept from them. The night was advancing. Eventually, at approximately 10 o'clock, the three men were released. In another case, this might have marked the end of the incident. Instead, it marked the beginning of the final stage of their lives. Once they were released, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner left Philadelphia in their core vehicle and resumed their journey toward Meridian. They were free to travel, but according to the investigation that followed, they were not free from danger. Price knew where they were going and had communicated with others. The men did not know that they were being watched. They could not know that the people who had been alerted to their movements were connected to a group prepared to intercept them. Their return journey, therefore, carried a danger invisible to them. From their perspective, they were simply going home. From the perspective of those pursuing them, the three men had become targets. A group connected to the Ku Klux Klan and other accomplices had been mobilized. Among the people later identified as connected to the events were Cecil Price, Wayne Roberts, James Jordan, Alton Wayne Roberts, Edgar Ray Killen, and other Klan members. Samuel Holloway Bowers, a Klan leader in Mississippi, was also an important figure in the circumstances surrounding the case, although he was not identified as the person who directly carried out the killings. The existence of this group transformed what might otherwise have remained a traffic-related arrest into part of a much larger and deadly sequence. The men in the core station wagon had no reason to understand the full significance of the people behind them. They had been released from jail. They were traveling toward Meridian. The road ahead appeared to lead home. But the events of the night were already moving in another direction. The arrest also demonstrated the complicated position of civil rights workers in Mississippi at the time. The movement was challenging racial discrimination and barriers that prevented black citizens from exercising their rights. Civil rights workers, therefore, depended on the law for protection while, at the same time, operating in communities where local institutions could be hostile to their work. The presence of a deputy sheriff in the sequence of events surrounding the disappearance would become especially disturbing because law enforcement represented the authority that citizens were expected to trust. When the three men left the jail, the ordinary expectation would have been that the law had finished with them. They had been arrested, held, and released. Their journey could continue. Instead, the investigation would later show that their movements were known to people outside the jail. The three men did not know that their release had not ended the danger. It had placed them back on the road at a moment when others were preparing to intercept them. There was also an important difference between the three men and the people who pursued them. Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were traveling together because they shared a civil rights mission. They had gone to Neshoba County to investigate a church burning and meet members of the community. Their purpose was connected to voting rights and civil rights. The group following them was connected to the Ku Klux Klan, an organization associated with opposition to the civil rights movement. The conflict that had surrounded their work was now becoming personal and physical. The road between Philadelphia and Meridian became the setting for the final stage of that conflict. Their Ford station wagon moved through the night. The men inside it were unaware that their journey was being followed. Behind them were people who had been mobilized after their release. Ahead of them was Meridian, the city from which they had departed that morning. The three men would never arrive. The arrest at Philadelphia would later stand out as one of the critical steps in reconstructing the sequence of events. It established the last known period in which the three were officially in custody. It placed them under the control of a local law enforcement officer, and their release, followed by their disappearance, raised questions that would remain at the center of the investigation. The fact that Price was a deputy sheriff and later became one of the people identified as connected to the events made the arrest particularly important. The case was no longer simply about three activists who had vanished on a rural road. It involved a chain of events in which a law enforcement officer, a group connected to the Klan, and the three missing men became connected in a sequence that would ultimately end in murder. But on that night, the three men did not know any of this. They had been released from jail. They had their vehicle. They were heading toward Meridian. They were young men returning from work. James Chaney was 21. Andrew Goodman was 20. Michael Schwerner was 24. Their lives were still measured in plans and responsibilities that extended beyond that night. Chaney had his work with CORE and the local community. Schwerner had his commitment to civil rights and the people he was organizing with. Goodman had only recently entered Mississippi as part of Freedom Summer. None of them knew that they were approaching the final moments of their lives. The people waiting for them had already begun to organize. The pursuit was underway. The arrest had ended, but the danger had not. Their vehicle continued along the road, carrying them away from Philadelphia and toward Meridian. They were no longer in police custody, but they were still within the reach of those who had learned where they were going. Soon, their vehicle would be stopped again. This time, the encounter would not end with an arrest and a release. It would become the beginning of a sequence of events from which none of the three would survive. And while the details of that night would later be reconstructed through investigation and prosecution, the immediate reality was brutally simple. Three men who had gone to investigate a burned church were now driving home under pursuit, unaware that the people following them intended to make sure they never reached their destination. The road from Philadelphia toward Meridian was supposed to be the final stretch of the day for James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. They had already completed the reason for their journey to Neshoba County. They had gone to investigate the burning of Mount Zion Methodist Church and meet with people in the local community. They had been stopped by Cecil Ray Price, a deputy sheriff, arrested over an allegation involving a traffic violation, taken to the Neshoba County Jail, and held there for several hours. Then, at approximately 10 o'clock that night, they were released. They left Philadelphia in their CORE Ford station wagon and began traveling toward Meridian. They did not know that they were being followed. Behind them, a group connected to the Ku Klux Klan and other accomplices had been mobilized. The events that had begun with the burning of a black church were moving toward their most violent conclusion. Among those later identified as connected to the events were Cecil Price, Wayne Roberts, James Jordan, Alton Wayne Roberts, Edgar Ray Killen, and other Klan members. Samuel Holloway Bowers, a Klan leader in Mississippi, was also an important figure in the broader circumstances surrounding the case, although he was not identified as the person who directly carried out the killings. For the three men inside the station wagon, however, these names meant nothing in that moment. They were simply trying to get home. Their destination remained Meridian. Their work was finished. The day should have been ending. Instead, somewhere along County Road 515, their journey was interrupted again. The three men were stopped. This time, the circumstances were entirely different from the earlier traffic-related arrest. They were no longer dealing with a routine law enforcement encounter that would eventually end in their release. The vehicle was forced off the main road. Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner were taken from their CORE station wagon and forced into another vehicle. Their own vehicle was then abandoned and burned. The destruction of the Ford station wagon would later become one of the physical signs that something terrible had happened to the three men. It was no longer simply a vehicle used by civil rights workers. It became evidence of a violent encounter that had taken place away from the public eye. The three men themselves were taken somewhere else. They were driven toward a remote area near Old Jolly Farm in Neshoba County. The choice of a secluded location was significant to what followed. The men had been removed from the main road and separated from the vehicle that connected them to their work. They were now in the custody of people who had been pursuing them. What happened next was not an accidental confrontation. According to the investigation and later court proceedings, the group had been mobilized to intercept the 3 civil rights workers. The men had been followed after leaving Philadelphia, and the encounter on the road led to a place where the killings could take place away from public view. The violence that followed ended the lives of all 3. Wayne Roberts was identified as the person who directly carried out the shootings. Michael Schwerner was shot. Andrew Goodman was shot. James Chaney was also shot. But the violence against Chaney did not end with the shooting. Evidence from the investigation showed that he had been beaten severely before he was killed. The 3 victims were then buried beneath a dirt dam on private property. Their bodies were hidden underground, separated from the road where they had been stopped and from the communities where their families and colleagues would begin looking for them. In the immediate aftermath, there was no public announcement explaining what had happened. There was no immediate discovery of the bodies. There were simply 3 missing men and a burned vehicle. Their disappearance would initially be treated as a missing person case, but the circumstances surrounding it were already extraordinary. 3 civil rights workers had vanished after traveling to Neshoba County. Their core vehicle had been abandoned and burned. They had been arrested earlier that evening by a local deputy sheriff and released at approximately 10 o'clock. According to the investigation that followed, the deputy knew where they were going and had communicated with others. After their release, they were followed. The sequence formed a disturbing chain: arrest, release, pursuit, interception, removal from the road, murder, and concealment of the bodies. At the time, however, the families and colleagues of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner did not yet have that complete picture. They knew only that the 3 men had not returned. Meridian had been their destination. They never arrived. The fact that the victims were 3 civil rights workers gave their disappearance an immediate significance beyond an ordinary missing person investigation. They had been working during Freedom Summer, a campaign that had brought hundreds of activists and volunteers into Mississippi to support Black citizens seeking to register to vote and to build stronger community institutions. Their work had already generated hostility. Mount Zion Methodist Church had been burned only days earlier. Chaney and Schwerner had returned to investigate that fire, and Goodman had accompanied them. Now all 3 were gone. Their disappearance therefore occurred within a context of racial tension, violence, and resistance to the civil rights movement. The location of the murders also mattered. The men had not disappeared in a public place where witnesses could easily see what happened. They had been taken away from the main road to a remote area near Old Jolly Farm. Their bodies were hidden beneath a dirt dam. This concealment delayed the discovery of the crime and created a terrible period of uncertainty for everyone searching for them. For 44 days, the truth remained hidden beneath the ground. During that period, the 3 men were officially missing. Their families could not yet know with certainty what had happened. Their colleagues could not say where they were. The country did not yet have the physical evidence that would confirm the worst possibility. But the burned core station wagon stood as an ominous clue. It showed that the journey had ended violently. The men had left Meridian in that vehicle. They had traveled to Neshoba County. They had been arrested and released. They had begun the return journey, and then the vehicle was stopped, taken off the road, and burned. The men disappeared at the same point in the chain. Later, the investigation would establish that their disappearance was not accidental and that they had been killed by people connected to the Ku Klux Klan and their accomplices. The violence against them reflected the larger conflict surrounding civil rights activism in Mississippi. Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner were working to expand voting rights and participation for Black Americans. Their presence in Neshoba County was connected to a church, a community, and a movement that had already faced intimidation and destruction. The people who opposed that movement did not merely reject its political goals. Some were prepared to use violence against those who participated in it. The murders, therefore, cannot be separated from the environment in which the three men were working. Yet the case remains most powerful when viewed through the lives of the victims themselves. James Chaney was 21. He was a young black man from Mississippi who understood the dangers surrounding civil rights activism and had nevertheless continued his work. Michael Schwerner was 24, a white man from New York who had moved to Mississippi with his wife and committed himself to working with black communities. Andrew Goodman was 20, a young student from New York who had recently arrived to participate in Freedom Summer. Their backgrounds were different, but their final destination was the same. They were trying to return to Meridian. They never reached it. The men who pursued them had turned a journey home into a deadly ambush. The three were taken away, murdered, and hidden. The Ford station wagon was burned, leaving behind an object that could not explain where the men had gone, but could demonstrate that something violent had occurred. For the people who knew Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the waiting now began. The authorities would have to determine where the men were. Their families would have to endure the uncertainty of not knowing whether they were alive. Their disappearance would soon attract national attention. The case would become too significant to remain a local matter. As word spread, the federal government would become involved, and the FBI would begin a massive search. The operation would eventually receive the code name Mississippi Burning or MyBurn. But before that investigation could reveal the truth, there was a long period in which the three men remained missing. Somewhere in Neshoba County, beneath a dirt dam on private property, their bodies had been deliberately concealed. Their families did not know where they were. The nation did not know what had happened. The men who had carried out the killings had attempted to bury the evidence along with the victims. They could hide the bodies, but they could not permanently erase the disappearance. Three names had already entered the public consciousness: James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner. Their last known journey had begun with a burned church and ended with a burned vehicle. Between those two fires lay a sequence of arrest, release, pursuit, and murder. The truth was still underground, but the search for it was about to become one of the largest investigations of the civil rights era. When James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner failed to return to Meridian, the first question was not who had killed them. It was where they were. Their disappearance created a period of uncertainty that would soon expand far beyond Neshoba County. Three civil rights workers had gone to investigate the burning of Mount Zion Methodist Church, had been arrested by a local deputy sheriff, had been released at approximately 10 o'clock that night, and had then disappeared while traveling back toward Meridian. Their core Ford station wagon was later found abandoned and burned. The vehicle provided a disturbing indication that something serious had happened, but it did not immediately reveal where the three men had gone. At first, the case was treated as a disappearance. There was no body, no complete public account of the final hours, and no immediate explanation for why three young men who had been expected back in Meridian had simply vanished. For their families, colleagues, and friends, the absence itself became the central fact. They were missing, and nobody could yet provide an answer. But the circumstances surrounding their disappearance were too serious to remain an ordinary local. Investigation. Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner were civil rights workers operating during Freedom Summer, a campaign that had already attracted national attention. Their work involved helping Black Americans register to vote, supporting community education, and encouraging greater participation in political life. The three had gone to Neshoba County because a black church had been burned. Their disappearance therefore occurred within an atmosphere already marked by racial hostility and violence. As the search expanded, the federal government became involved. The FBI opened a major investigation, and hundreds of personnel were mobilized. The search was not confined to one road or one suspected location. Investigators examined rivers, forests, farms, and rural areas across the region. The scale of the operation reflected the seriousness of the case. 3 people had disappeared, and the possibility that they had been harmed could not be ignored. The search also exposed something larger about the environment in which they had disappeared. During the operation, authorities discovered the bodies of other Black Americans who had previously disappeared or been killed. Those discoveries made the case even more disturbing. The search for 3 civil rights workers was revealing evidence of a wider history of violence. The missing men were not simply individuals who had vanished under unexplained circumstances. Their disappearance had occurred in a region where Black communities and civil rights activists had faced intimidation, violence, and destruction. The investigation was therefore becoming a window into a much broader problem. The country was watching. The disappearance of 3 young men, 2 of them white Northerners and 1 a Black Mississippian, attracted national attention. The fact that civil rights workers could disappear after traveling to investigate a burned Black church raised questions that went far beyond the immediate whereabouts of the victims. It raised questions about safety, law enforcement, racial violence, and the ability of local authorities to protect the people who were working for civil rights. President Lyndon B. Johnson and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy took an interest in the case. Their attention reflected the national importance of the disappearance. The federal government was now deeply involved in a search taking place in rural Mississippi. The FBI assigned a code name to the operation, Mississippi Burning, abbreviated as MyBurn. The name would eventually become inseparable from the case itself. At this stage, however, the name represented an ongoing search rather than a solved crime. Investigators did not yet have the complete story. They knew that the men had disappeared after leaving Philadelphia. They knew that their vehicle had been burned. They knew that the men had been arrested earlier that evening and released. They knew that a local deputy sheriff, Cecil Ray Price, had been involved in the arrest. And according to the investigation that followed, Price knew where the men were going and had communicated with other people. These facts gave investigators a sequence to examine, but they did not immediately reveal the final location of the victims. The search continued through the countryside. Rivers and wooded areas were examined. Farms and rural properties were searched. The investigation became increasingly extensive because the men could have been anywhere. Every day without an answer added to the uncertainty. For the families of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the waiting must have been defined by the absence of information. But the investigation could not stop. The burned vehicle suggested that the disappearance was connected to violence, and the circumstances surrounding the arrest and release created additional questions. Why had the 3 men been followed? Who knew their destination? Who had organized the pursuit? Where had they been taken after their vehicle was stopped? The answers were not immediately available. What investigators did have was the knowledge that the 3 men had been traveling together and that they had not reached Meridian. The search continued until August 4, 1964. 44 days had passed since their disappearance. On that day, investigators discovered the bodies of James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner beneath a dirt dam on private property near Philadelphia, Mississippi. The discovery finally answered the most painful question of the entire case. The 3 men were dead. They had not simply disappeared. They had been murdered. The location of the bodies confirmed that they had been deliberately hidden. The discovery transformed the case from a disappearance into a murder investigation. The long period of uncertainty ended with a physical reality that could no longer be denied. Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner had been buried beneath the earth while the search for them continued above ground. Their bodies were concealed, but the search had eventually reached them. The discovery also provided investigators with the evidence necessary to reconstruct what had happened. According to the investigation and later court proceedings, the 3 had been taken from their vehicle after being stopped on County Road 515. They had been forced into another vehicle and taken to a remote area near Old Jolly Farm. Their core station wagon had been abandoned and burned. The men had then been killed, with Wayne Roberts identified as the person who directly carried out the shootings. Goodman and Schwerner were shot first. Cheney was also shot and had been severely beaten before his death. Their bodies were then buried beneath the dirt dam. The search had lasted 44 days because the people responsible had attempted to conceal the evidence. But the discovery of the bodies did more than establish the fate of 3 missing men. It exposed the scale of the violence surrounding the civil rights struggle in Mississippi. The case now demanded accountability. The question changed from where are they to who did this and why. That question would prove far more difficult to answer through the justice system. The discovery came at a critical moment in the civil rights era. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been signed into law only weeks before the 3 men disappeared. Yet the murders demonstrated that the existence of federal legislation did not automatically end racial violence or guarantee safety for people working to enforce those rights. The events in Neshoba County showed the distance between legal change and the realities faced by activists on the ground. The Freedom Summer Campaign had been designed to challenge barriers to Black voting and political participation. In response, civil rights workers faced threats, violence, and destruction. Now 3 of those workers were dead. The national attention surrounding the case increased dramatically after their bodies were found. What had begun as a local disappearance had become a national symbol. Mississippi was no longer simply the location of a missing person investigation. It had become the center of a national discussion about civil rights, racial violence, law enforcement, and justice. The name Mississippi Burning captured the emotional and political significance of the case. The burned church had been one of the events that brought Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner into Neshoba County. The burned Corps station wagon became a sign of what had happened to them. And beneath a dirt dam, investigators found the final evidence of their fate. But finding the bodies was only the beginning of another difficult chapter. The investigators now had to identify those responsible and determine how the crime had been organized. The evidence pointed toward a group connected to the Ku Klux Klan and other accomplices. Names began to emerge: Cecil Price, Wayne Roberts, James Jordan, Alton Wayne Roberts, Edgar Ray Killen, and other Klan members. Samuel Holloway Bowers, a Klan leader in Mississippi, was an important figure in the broader circumstances, although he was not identified as the person who directly carried out the killings. The investigation would eventually lead to prosecutions, but the path to justice would be long. The 3 bodies had been found after 44 days. The truth about the murders would take far longer to fully confront. The discovery of August 4th, 1964, therefore marked both an ending and a beginning. It ended the painful uncertainty over whether the 3 men were alive. But it began the harder process of determining responsibility. The country now knew that James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner had been murdered. The next question was whether the people responsible would ever be held accountable. That question would remain unresolved for years. In the months and years that followed, the federal government would pursue the case through civil rights law. Some of those connected to the murders would eventually be convicted, but the penalties would be relatively limited. One central figure, Edgar Ray Killen, would escape a final verdict in 1967 and remain free for decades. The case would not truly reach its final judicial chapter until 2005. For 44 days, the 3 men had been missing. For decades afterward, the question of justice would remain. The search had found their bodies, but it could not immediately erase the injustice that had allowed their killers to avoid full accountability. Mississippi Burning had become more than the name of an FBI operation. It had become a permanent reminder of what happened when a campaign for basic civil rights collided with organized racial violence. And the discovery beneath that dirt dam ensured that the names of James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner could never again be dismissed as the names of 3 people who simply disappeared on a Mississippi road. They had been found. Their deaths had been confirmed. And now, the investigation would have to follow the evidence toward the people responsible. Finding the bodies of James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, And Michael Schwerner answered the first terrible question in the case, but it did not answer the question that followed. The country now knew what had happened to the 3 civil rights workers. They had not disappeared voluntarily. They had not simply become lost on a rural road. They had been murdered and deliberately buried beneath a dirt dam near Philadelphia, Mississippi. The next question was far more difficult. Who would be held responsible? The investigation had already established a disturbing chain of events. The 3 men had traveled to Neshoba County to investigate the burning of Mount Zion Methodist Church. They had been arrested by Cecil Ray Price, a deputy sheriff, on an allegation involving a traffic violation. They were taken to the Neshoba County Jail, their core vehicle was held, and they were eventually released at approximately 10 o'clock that night. According to the investigation, Price knew where they were going and communicated with other people. After their release, the 3 men began their journey toward Meridian, unaware that they were being followed. They were intercepted, taken from their vehicle, and transported to a remote area near Old Jolly Farm. Their core station wagon was abandoned and burned. According to the investigation and later court proceedings, Wayne Roberts was identified as the person who directly carried out the shootings. Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman were shot first. James Chaney was also shot after having been severely beaten. Their bodies were then concealed beneath the dirt dam. The evidence therefore pointed toward a coordinated act involving people connected to the Ku Klux Klan and other accomplices. Among those later identified as connected to the events were Cecil Price, Wayne Roberts, James Jordan, Alton Wayne Roberts, Edgar Ray Killen, and other Klan members. Samuel Holloway Bowers, a Klan leader in Mississippi, was also an important figure in the broader circumstances surrounding the case, although he was not identified as the person who directly carried out the killings. With the discovery of the bodies, the investigation could now move from searching for the victims to pursuing those believed responsible. But the road to justice would not be straightforward. The case exposed a fundamental problem of the period. The murders had occurred in Mississippi, but the local system did not immediately deliver the kind of murder prosecutions that many people expected. The federal government therefore became central to the legal response. In 1967, federal authorities brought charges against 18 people under federal civil rights law. The legal strategy was significant because the federal government faced limitations in directly prosecuting the killings themselves under the laws available at the time. Instead, the prosecution relied on federal civil rights statutes. This meant that the case entered court through a legal path that was not identical to a conventional murder prosecution. The murders were established as facts of the case, but the federal charges focused on violations of civil rights. 7 people were ultimately convicted. Cecil Price was among those convicted. Yet the sentences were relatively limited, with the highest punishment amounting to only several years in prison. No one was convicted of murder in that federal trial. For many observers, this was one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case. 3 young men had been killed. Their bodies had been hidden. The investigation had uncovered a group connected to the Ku Klux Klan and other accomplices. Yet the legal consequences did not initially correspond to the enormity of the crime. The difference between what had happened and what the courts were able to punish became a defining feature of Mississippi burning. The federal government had succeeded in obtaining convictions, but the convictions did not erase the sense that justice had fallen short. The limitations were partly legal. Federal authorities had restrictions on how they could prosecute the murders themselves under the laws then available. At the same time, Mississippi authorities did not quickly bring the case forward as a murder prosecution. As a result, several people connected to the events faced only relatively short sentences. The case therefore remained unfinished in the eyes of many people. One of the most important figures in that unfinished story was Edgar Ray Killen. Killen was a figure with a leadership role in the Ku Klux Klan in the area. The evidence later showed that he had participated in organizing the group involved in the murders. His importance was therefore not simply as another name among those connected to the crime. He represented the organizational dimension of what had happened. The murders were not merely the result of an isolated encounter on a dark road. They were connected to people who had mobilized against civil rights workers. Yet in 1967, Killen did not receive a final conviction. His trial ended in a mistrial because the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. The result meant that Killen was not convicted at that time. He remained free. Decades passed. The case did not disappear, but the people directly connected to it grew older. Some died before they could ever face another trial. Others continued living with the knowledge that the legal consequences of the murders had never fully matched the crime. For the families of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner, the passage of time could not change what had happened. James Chaney was still 21 when he was murdered. Andrew Goodman was 20. Michael Schwerner was 24. Their lives had ended in 1964, but the legal history of the case continued long after them. The failure to obtain murder convictions at the time became part of the larger legacy of the case. Mississippi Burning was now remembered not only as a story of racial violence, but also as an example of how difficult it could be to obtain justice when local institutions failed to fully confront such violence. The case was not completely forgotten. In 2005, Mississippi reopened the investigation. More than 40 years had passed since the murders. By then, many of the people connected to the original case were elderly, and some had already died. But the evidence from the earlier investigation remained. The decision to reopen the case demonstrated that the passage of time had not erased the responsibility associated with the deaths of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Edgar Ray Killen was eventually arrested. He was 80 years old when he was brought to trial in Mississippi. The circumstances were dramatically different from those of 1967. The young civil rights workers were long dead. The original investigation was more than 4 decades old. The people who had once stood at the center of the case had aged. But the fundamental question remained unchanged. What responsibility did Killen bear for the deaths of the 3 men? In 2005, Killen was convicted of 3 counts of manslaughter. He received a sentence of 60 years in prison, 20 years for each victim. It was a significant moment in the history of the case because it represented the first time that someone was convicted in Mississippi for direct criminal responsibility connected to the killings of the 3 civil rights workers. The conviction could not restore the lives that had been taken. It could not return Chaney to his family, Goodman to his loved ones, or Schwerner to his wife and colleagues. It could not erase the 41 years that had passed since the murders. But it represented a legal acknowledgement that had been absent for decades. The case had finally produced a conviction in Mississippi connected directly to the deaths. Killen remained in prison until his death in 2018 at the age of 92. He did not return to freedom. His death closed one of the final chapters of the long legal history of Mississippi Burning, although it did not resolve every question surrounding the case. Some people who were suspected of involvement or investigated in connection with the murders had died before they could be prosecuted. The legal record, therefore, remained incomplete. Not everyone connected to the crime faced a courtroom. Not every person who had been part of the broader chain of events received a final judgment. That reality is an important part of understanding the case. Justice eventually came to one central figure, but it came decades after the 3 men had been killed. The story of the trials is therefore also a story about time. In 1964, the country searched for 3 missing civil rights workers. In 1967, federal authorities obtained several convictions, but no murder convictions. Edgar Ray Killen escaped a final verdict because of the mistrial. Then, in 2005, after more than 4 decades, the case returned to court in Mississippi. Killen was 80 years old. The victims had been dead for 41 years. The final conviction could not change the past, but it demonstrated that the passage of time did not necessarily erase accountability. The legal history of Mississippi Burning also revealed the limits of the justice system during the civil rights era. The federal government could intervene, but the laws available at the time shaped how prosecutors could proceed. The local justice system did not immediately deliver murder convictions. The result was a gap between the crime and its punishment. That gap became part of the historical significance of the case. The murders had been committed in 1964, but the story of responsibility stretched into the 21st century. Through all those years, the names of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner remained at the center. They were not simply evidence in a prosecution. They were three young people whose lives had been taken because of the environment surrounding the civil rights struggle. Their deaths became part of the national memory of Freedom Summer and the broader fight for racial equality. The courts could eventually convict individuals, but no sentence could fully account for what had been lost. The 60-year sentence imposed on Killen in 2005 represented a formal judgment, but it arrived in a world far removed from the Mississippi of 1964. The case had crossed generations. Those who had once waited for the missing men had grown old. Those who had investigated the murders had aged or died. Some people involved in the violence were gone. Yet the evidence had endured, and so had the memory of the victims. Mississippi burning, therefore, became a case in which justice was not measured simply by the length of a sentence. It was also measured by whether the country was willing, decades later, to reopen a wound that had never truly closed. In 1967, the law had produced convictions but no murder verdicts. In 2005, it finally produced a Mississippi conviction against Edgar Ray Killen for 3 counts of manslaughter. The delay was extraordinary. The consequence was irreversible. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner could never see that final judgment, but their names remained attached to it. And as Killen entered the final years of his life in prison, the case had reached a point that seemed impossible decades earlier. A central figure in the events had finally been held criminally accountable in the state where the 3 young men had been killed. The road to that moment had taken more than 40 years. The road had begun with a burned church, continued through a night of pursuit and murder, passed through a massive federal search and a difficult series of prosecutions, and eventually returned to Mississippi itself. Yet even after Killen's conviction and death, one question remained larger than any courtroom. What did the deaths of these 3 young men mean for the country they had tried to change? The answer would be found not only in the legal record, but in the continuing memory of their lives, their work, and the civil rights movement for which they had risked everything. The murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner did not end when their bodies were recovered on August 4, 1964. In many ways, that discovery marked the beginning of a different chapter. For 44 days, the central question had been where the 3 men were. Once investigators found their bodies beneath a dirt dam near Philadelphia, Mississippi, there was no longer any uncertainty about their fate. They had been murdered. The next challenge was to determine responsibility and confront what their deaths revealed about the environment in which they had been working. The discovery transformed Mississippi burning from a disappearance into one of the defining criminal cases of the civil rights era. It also forced the country to look more closely at the violence surrounding Freedom Summer. The 3 men had not been random travelers. They had been participating in a campaign intended to help Black Americans exercise rights that, despite existing constitutional protections, were routinely obstructed in Mississippi. James Chaney had been working with the Congress of Racial Equality, helping with civil rights activities in his home state. Michael Schwerner had come from New York with his wife, Rita, and had devoted himself to organizing within Black communities. Andrew Goodman, only 20 years old, had arrived from New York to participate in Freedom Summer. Their backgrounds were different, but their work had brought them together. The immediate chain of events had begun with the burning of Mount Zion Methodist Church on June 16th. The church was part of a Black community in Neshoba County, and Chaney and Schwerner had been concerned about the possibility of using it for civil rights activities. After the fire, they decided to return to investigate. Goodman accompanied them. Their trip on June 21st was therefore not an isolated adventure. It was part of an organized effort to support civil rights in Mississippi. that context became increasingly important after the murders. Freedom Summer had brought hundreds of volunteers and activists into Mississippi. Their goals included helping Black citizens register to vote, establishing community schools, and encouraging greater participation in political life. To supporters of the movement, these were fundamental democratic rights. To those who opposed the movement, however, the campaign represented a threat to the existing racial order. The violence directed toward activists demonstrated how fiercely that order could be defended. The burning of Mount Zion Methodist Church was one example. The murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were another, far more devastating example. Their deaths showed that the danger facing civil rights workers was not theoretical. Threats could become physical attacks, and attacks could become murder. The involvement of a local law enforcement officer made the case even more disturbing. Cecil Ray Price, a deputy sheriff of Neshoba County, had stopped the three men and arrested them over an allegation involving a traffic violation. He took them to the county jail and held their core vehicle. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, the men were released. According to the investigation that followed, Price knew where they were going and communicated with other people. After leaving Philadelphia, the three were followed. They were stopped again on County Road 515, forced from their vehicle, and taken away from the main road. Their Ford station wagon was abandoned and burned. The men were then taken to a remote location near Old Jolly Farm. According to the investigation and later proceedings, Wayne Roberts was the person who directly carried out the shootings. Goodman and Schwerner were shot first. Cheney was also shot, after being severely beaten. Their bodies were buried beneath a dirt dam on private property. The sequence demonstrated that the murders were not the result of an unpredictable accident. The investigation connected them to a group involving Ku Klux Klan members and other accomplices. Among the people later identified as connected to the events were Price, Roberts, James Jordan, Alton Wayne Roberts, Edgar Ray Killen, and others. Samuel Holloway Bowers, a Klan leader in Mississippi, was also an important figure in the broader circumstances, although he was not identified as the person who directly carried out the killings. The federal investigation became one of the largest searches associated with the civil rights era. Hundreds of personnel were involved. Investigators searched rivers, forests, farms, and rural areas. The operation extended across the countryside because the missing men could have been hidden almost anywhere. During the search, authorities also discovered the bodies of other Black people who had disappeared or been killed. These discoveries gave the investigation an even darker significance. The search for three civil rights workers was revealing evidence of a broader history of violence. Mississippi Burning was no longer simply about three individuals. It was becoming a symbol of the dangers faced by Black communities and civil rights activists. Throughout the region, the involvement of the federal government also demonstrated how seriously the disappearance had been taken at the national level. President Lyndon B. Johnson and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy were concerned about the case. The FBI gave the operation the code name Mississippi Burning, or MyBurn. The name later became permanently associated with the murders. The attention surrounding the case came at a crucial moment in American history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been signed into law only weeks before the three men disappeared. That law represented an enormous legal change, but the murders showed the difference between legislation and reality. A law could establish rights, but it could not instantly eliminate hatred, intimidation, or violence. In Mississippi, people working to help Black citizens exercise their rights could still face extraordinary danger. The deaths of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner made that contradiction impossible to ignore. Their case became a powerful illustration of why federal involvement remained necessary. The murders also had a particular symbolic force because two of the victims were white men from New York, and one was a Black man from Mississippi. Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman had come south to support the civil rights movement. James Cheney was already part of the struggle within his own community. Their deaths demonstrated that racial violence could reach anyone who challenged the system, while the treatment of Cheney highlighted the especially severe racial hatred directed toward Black Americans. The investigation showed that Cheney had been beaten severely before he was killed. That distinction became part of the historical memory of the case. The three victims were united in death, but the violence inflicted upon them was not identical. Cheney's experience reflected the racial hierarchy that the movement was attempting to dismantle. Goodman and Schwerner's deaths, meanwhile, demonstrated the willingness of their attackers to kill white activists who crossed racial boundaries and worked alongside Black communities. The case, therefore, became a symbol of interracial cooperation, as well as the violence used to oppose it. The legal aftermath was complicated. In 1967, federal authorities prosecuted 18 people under federal civil rights laws. 7 were convicted, including Cecil Price. Yet the sentences were relatively light, and no one was convicted of murder in that federal proceeding. The legal limitations of the period were important. Federal authorities could use civil rights laws, but the ability to prosecute the killings themselves through federal law was restricted. Mississippi authorities also did not immediately deliver the kind of murder prosecutions many people expected. The result was a profound disparity between the seriousness of the crime and the punishment imposed. One of the most important figures in this history was Edgar Ray Killen. Killen held a leadership role in the Ku Klux Klan in the area and was later shown to have participated in organizing the group involved in the murders. Yet in 1967, his trial ended in a mistrial because the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. Killen was not convicted. He remained free for decades while the names of the 3 victims continued to represent an unresolved chapter in American history. The case remained open in the broader sense even as time passed. In 2005, Mississippi reopened the investigation. By then, more than 40 years had passed since the murders. Many of the people connected to the original investigation were elderly or had already died. But the evidence remained. Killen was arrested and brought to trial at the age of 80. This time, the result was different. He was convicted of 3 counts of manslaughter and sentenced to 60 years in prison, 20 years for each victim. The conviction represented a significant moment because it was the first time that someone had been convicted in Mississippi for direct criminal responsibility connected to the deaths of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Yet even this judgment could not fully resolve the history of the case. The conviction arrived more than 4 decades after the murders. The families had lived for years with the knowledge that the men had been killed, while many of those responsible had escaped serious punishment. Some suspected participants died before they could be prosecuted. Others were never brought before a court for their alleged roles. Killen remained imprisoned until his death in 2018 at the age of 92. His death closed one of the final legal chapters, but it did not erase the larger meaning of Mississippi burning. The case had become part of the history of Freedom Summer, the civil rights movement, and the struggle over voting rights in America. It demonstrated the danger faced by those who challenge racial discrimination and the limits of local justice when institutions failed to confront violence. It also showed how long accountability can take when a crime is not fully addressed when it first occurs. Perhaps the most enduring consequence of the murders lies in the fact that the 3 victims continued to be remembered as individuals rather than simply as names in a historical case. James Cheney was 21 years old. Andrew Goodman was 20. Michael Schwerner was 24. They were young men who had entered Mississippi because they believed that Black Americans should be able to participate fully in the political life of their country. They went to Neshoba County because a church had been burned. They intended to investigate, meet with members of the community, and return to Meridian. Instead, they were arrested, released, followed, intercepted, murdered, and buried. Their deaths exposed a reality that legislation alone could not conceal. The struggle for civil rights was not simply a debate over laws. It was a conflict over whether those laws would be recognized and enforced in communities where resistance to equality remained deeply entrenched. Mississippi burning became one of the clearest demonstrations of that conflict. The murders also contributed to the national understanding of why voting rights required more than promises. Black citizens needed protection and meaningful access to the political process. Freedom Summer had attempted to build that access from the ground up, and the violence against its workers showed the risks involved. The following year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 became law. The murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner were not the sole cause of that legislation, but their deaths became part of the national history surrounding the demand for stronger federal protection of voting rights and civil rights. Their names remained attached to a moment when the country was forced to confront the cost of racial inequality. The story of Mississippi burning is therefore not only about what happened on June 21, 1964. It is also about what happened afterward, the search, the discovery, the trials, the decades of waiting, and the eventual conviction of Edgar Ray Killen. It is about a justice system that acted, but acted incompletely and slowly. And it is about three young men whose work continued to have meaning after their deaths. The dirt dam where their bodies were hidden could conceal the victims for 44 days, but it could not bury the historical significance of what had happened. The burned church, the burned station wagon, the missing men, and the eventual discovery of their bodies became part of a larger national memory. Mississippi burning remains a reminder that the struggle for civil rights was carried out not in abstraction, but through the lives of real people who accepted extraordinary risks. James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner left Meridian on June 21st expecting to return. They never did. Their deaths became a symbol of racial violence, Klan intimidation, and the courage of those who continued working for equality despite the dangers. And the long delay before justice was achieved became another part of their legacy, a reminder that remembering a crime is not the same as resolving it, and that accountability sometimes arrives only after decades have passed. The story of Mississippi burning cannot be understood only through the murders of James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. Their deaths were the most devastating moment in a much larger struggle, one that had been unfolding across Mississippi and the American South for years. The three men entered that struggle during Freedom Summer, when civil rights organizations were attempting to challenge the barriers that prevented Black Americans from registering to vote and participating fully in political life. Their work was built around a simple principle: that citizenship should mean more than possessing a legal status on paper. It should include the practical ability to vote, to attend schools, to organize communities, and to participate without fear. Yet in Mississippi in 1964, pursuing those rights could place people in extraordinary danger. The burning of Mount Zion Methodist Church demonstrated that danger before the three men ever made their final journey. The church was part of a Black community in Neshoba County, and Cheney and Schwerner had been interested in its potential as a location for civil rights activity. When it was burned on June 16th, they decided to return to the area to investigate. Andrew Goodman accompanied them. 5 days later, they left Meridian together. They did not know that the investigation would become their final assignment. Their journey ended with their arrest by Cecil Ray Price, their release from jail at approximately 10 o'clock that night, and their subsequent pursuit by men connected to the Ku Klux Klan and other accomplices. Their Ford station wagon was stopped on County Road 515. The three men were taken away from the road and transported to a remote location near Old Jolly Farm. Their vehicle was burned. According to the investigation and later court proceedings, Wayne Roberts directly carried out the shootings. Schwerner and Goodman were shot first. Cheney was also shot after being severely beaten. Their bodies were buried beneath a dirt dam on private property. 44 days later, on August 4th, investigators found them. By then, the case had become a national symbol. But the meaning of Mississippi burning continued to grow long after the bodies were recovered. One reason was the contrast between the ideals of American law and the reality faced by the victims. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been signed only weeks before their disappearance. On paper, the country was taking a major step toward ending racial discrimination. Yet in the same period, civil rights workers in Mississippi were still facing threats, violence, church burnings, and other forms of intimidation. The murders revealed that legal reform did not instantly transform the communities where discrimination was deeply established. A federal law could declare rights. It could prohibit discrimination. But the existence of a law did not guarantee that every local institution would enforce those rights willingly or protect the people demanding them. That contradiction became one of the central lessons of the case. The role of local law enforcement was particularly difficult to ignore. Cecil Price was a deputy sheriff, and he was the officer who stopped and arrested Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. He took them to jail, held their vehicle, and later released them. According to the investigation, he knew where they were going and communicated with others. Price was subsequently among those convicted in the federal civil rights prosecution of 1967. His involvement meant that the case could not be viewed solely as a confrontation between civil rights workers and unidentified private attackers. The chain of events included a member of local law enforcement. That fact intensified the national concern surrounding the murders because law enforcement officers were expected to provide protection and uphold the law. The legal response that followed also revealed the difficulties of obtaining justice. In 1967, 18 people were prosecuted federally under civil rights laws. 7 were convicted, including Price. Yet no one was convicted of murder in that federal proceeding. The sentences were comparatively light, with the highest punishment amounting to only several years. The reason was partly rooted in the legal framework available at the time. Federal prosecutors were able to use civil rights statutes, but they faced limitations in prosecuting the killings themselves under federal law. Mississippi authorities also did not quickly produce murder convictions. The result was an extraordinary imbalance. 3 young men had been murdered, their bodies deliberately concealed, and the people connected to the crime initially faced consequences that many regarded as inadequate. Edgar Ray Killen became one of the clearest examples of that unresolved justice. Killen held a leadership role in the Ku Klux Klan in the area and was later shown to have participated in organizing the group involved in the murders. Yet in 1967, his trial ended in a mistrial because the jury could not reach a unanimous decision. Killen was not convicted. The legal process had reached him, but it had not produced a final judgment. He remained free while the case slowly became part of American history. For the families of the victims, however, history was not something that belonged only to textbooks or documentaries. It was personal. James Cheney had been 21 years old. He was a black Mississippian from Meridian who had chosen to work with CORE and participate in civil rights activities in his own state. He understood the environment around him better than the 2 men who had come from New York. Yet his knowledge did not protect him. Michael Schwerner was 24. He had moved from New York to Mississippi with his wife, Rita, to work with black communities and support civil rights. Andrew Goodman was only 20. He had arrived in Mississippi to participate in Freedom Summer and had been there for a relatively short time before disappearing. Their different backgrounds became part of what made the case so powerful. Cheney's death revealed the severe violence directed toward black civil rights workers. Goodman and Schwerner's deaths demonstrated that white activists from outside the South could also become targets when they crossed racial boundaries and worked alongside black communities. Together, their deaths exposed the violent resistance confronting the movement. The national impact of the case also came from the scale of the search. When the 3 men disappeared, the federal government became involved. President Lyndon B. Johnson and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy took an interest in the case. The FBI organized a major operation involving hundreds of personnel. Rivers, forests, farms, and rural areas were searched. The investigation was given the code name Mississippi Burning, or MyBurn. During the search, investigators found the remains of other black people who had previously disappeared or been killed. Those discoveries expanded the significance of the operation. The search for 3 missing civil rights workers was exposing evidence of a wider pattern of violence. The country was being forced to confront the possibility that the murders were not an isolated event, but part of a broader environment in which Black people and civil rights activists could be threatened with impunity. The discovery of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner's bodies, therefore, became a moment of national reckoning. Their deaths could no longer be dismissed as an unexplained disappearance. The evidence showed that they had been deliberately killed and hidden. The investigation connected the murders to members of the Ku Klux Klan and their accomplices. The names of people involved gradually became part of the public record. Yet the passage of time created another kind of injustice. Years became decades. People connected to the case aged. Some died. Others remained outside prison. Killen, who had escaped a final verdict in 1967, continued to live for decades after the murders. Then in 2005, Mississippi reopened the case. The decision came 41 years after the deaths. By then, the 3 victims had been gone for most of their adult lives. Killen was 80 years old when he was finally brought to trial in Mississippi. The trial resulted in his conviction on 3 counts of manslaughter. He received 60 years in prison, 20 years for each victim. The conviction represented an important moment because it was the first time someone had been convicted in Mississippi for direct criminal responsibility connected to the killings. But the sentence also carried the unmistakable weight of delay. Justice had arrived after 4 decades. It could not restore the lives of the 3 men. It could not return Cheney to his family or Goodman and Schwerner to theirs. It could not undo the pain created by the murders or the years during which accountability remained incomplete. Still, the conviction demonstrated that the case had not been forgotten. Killen died in prison in 2018 at the age of 92. His death ended another chapter, but not the historical questions raised by Mississippi burning. Some people who were suspected of involvement or investigated in connection with the murders died before they could be prosecuted. Others never faced a final criminal judgment for their alleged roles. The legal record, therefore, remained incomplete. Yet the story of the case cannot be measured only by the number of convictions. Its influence was also political and historical. The murders became associated with Freedom Summer and the continuing effort to secure voting rights for Black Americans. The following year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted. The murders were not the sole cause of that legislation, but they formed part of the national context demonstrating why stronger federal protection of voting rights was necessary. The lesson was difficult but clear. Passing legislation was only one step. Rights had to be enforced, and citizens needed meaningful protection when exercising them. The deaths of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner became part of the evidence that the federal government could not simply assume local institutions would always protect civil rights. Their story also illustrates how memory can outlast the people who committed the crime. The men who buried the bodies believed they could conceal what had happened. The bodies remained hidden for 44 days, but the truth eventually emerged. The legal process was slower still, taking more than 4 decades to produce a conviction against Killen in Mississippi. Yet the names of the victims survived every stage of that delay. James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner became symbols. But they should not be remembered only as symbols. Before they became names associated with a historic crime, they were young people with lives of their own. Cheney was a local activist who understood the danger but continued his work. Schwerner had chosen to leave New York and work alongside Black communities in Mississippi. Goodman had traveled south as a young volunteer during Freedom Summer. Their final journey began because a church had been burned. They wanted to understand what had happened and continue their work. They expected to return to Meridian. Instead, they became victims of a coordinated act of violence. The enduring importance of Mississippi burning lies partly in this transformation. A trip that began with an effort to help a community became a crime that forced an entire country to examine the relationship between civil rights, law enforcement, racial violence, and justice. The case showed how vulnerable activists could be when local institutions were unwilling or unable to protect them. It showed how difficult accountability could become when violence was allowed to go unanswered. And it showed that the passage of time does not necessarily erase the responsibility to confront the past. More than 60 years after the murders, the names remain connected to one of the most painful chapters of the American civil rights movement. Their story is remembered because 3 people disappeared on a Mississippi road and were found beneath a dirt dam 44 days later. But it endures for a deeper reason. Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner represented people who believed that the promise of equal rights should become a reality. Their deaths demonstrated the cost of challenging a system built on discrimination. Their investigation, their search, their trials, and the eventual conviction of Edgar Ray Killen became part of a larger national reckoning. Mississippi Burning was never only about what happened to 3 men on one night. It was about what their deaths revealed about America at a moment when the country was being forced to decide whether civil rights would exist only as words in law or as rights that ordinary people could actually exercise.